Transgender representation in video games. It's hardly a thing that ever happens, especially positive representation. But let me tell you about this amazing little game I recently played called The Missing, J.J. Macfield and the Island of Memories. That title is certainly a mouthful, and I've also been wanting to talk about games on here more in general, so what better than picking a game that has a kick-ass trans woman in the lead of the game? And sorry y'all, that is somewhat of a spoiler because that's supposed to be a plot twist. I knew this going in, and it did not diminish my experience at all, in my opinion. Especially since the main reason I played it is because I knew that JJ, the main character, is trans. If I hadn't known that, I probably would have never picked up the game in the first place. For all my trans viewers and gamers out there, you would probably figure it out pretty quickly because there are multiple hints scattered throughout the world before it is blatantly revealed near the end of the game that JJ is trans. But I think that's part of the reason why I love the game so much. It's a journey. It's like a coming out journey in a way, and you're along for the ride with JJ. But be warned, this may not be surprising, but the game has some distressing content. Experiences of transphobia, discussions of suicide, being outed, dealing with a parent who, at least for some portion of the game, thinks that conversion therapy is the way to go. That being said, JJ does have some amazing people in her life that do love and support her regardless of who she is. Specifically her best friend Emily. And I think it does a good job of highlighting the struggles that many trans people face, especially early in their journeys, especially before even coming out to anyone, let alone even coming out to themselves fully. I think it does a good job of highlighting many of these struggles without making it entirely doom and gloom, which I think is a very fine line to tread when it comes to these types of stories, wanting to focus so much on the negative or focus so much on the positive that it ends up being either too depressing or just too unrealistic. I mean, not that this game is realistic in terms of the content itself, which I'll get to. But know that the story is very dark. The gameplay itself is also very macabre as well. The game starts with you going on a camping trip with your best friend Emily. Sounds like a good horror movie if you ask me. You definitely get some queer vibes from them. But things quickly take a turn for the worse when you wake up and Emily is suddenly nowhere to be found. So you set out on an adventure to find her, and that's essentially the whole game. You set out on this adventure, and along the way you bring your childhood stuffed animal named FK. It's strange, but FK is actually a major character in the story. And honestly, the entire game is strange, so having a talking stuffed animal with you is probably not the most strange thing in the game. It's made by a guy named Swery. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And if you've played any of his other games or even just know about any of his other games like Deadly Premonition, then you'll have a good idea of how quirky and strange the world in The Missing is. And like Deadly Premonition, The Missing has lots of horror elements, but I would not call it scary. In terms of gameplay, the entire game is a side-scrolling puzzle platformer. I will admit, not my favorite type of game generally, but it is very well done, and it constantly left me wanting to continue to find out the next bit of the story. And yeah, I mean, the main character being trans, and also the really good writing in the game. The voice acting is pretty terrible.
You always say
really?
that.
Oh no.
Nuh-uh. Oh my gosh.
Oh.
Oh, stop it. It's such a beautiful night.
Yeah, it sure is.
But the writing is pretty good. You mostly just go from one area to the next, solving light puzzles, avoiding enemies, scaling platforms. You don't actually fight any of the enemies, but there are some that will try to kill you or dismember you. There's a recurring monster that you run from throughout the game. You're basically just on this journey to find Emily and find yourself along the way while facing lots of literal and metaphorical demons. Surprisingly, it does not get too repetitive, largely thanks to an interesting game mechanic. Interesting is a nice way to put it. Yeah, it doesn't take long for the gruesome nature of the game to show up, and, with that, the main way to solve many of the puzzles. So very early in the game, you're running through a field of flowers, trying to find Emily. A very heartfelt, original song for this game is playing in the background. It's like, okay, this sounds nice. And then suddenly you're struck by lightning, you catch on fire, you scream, and you're burnt to a crisp. Yep, then you learn you have the ability to regenerate yourself. Interesting. So death is not the end. Many of the puzzles in this game are solved by dismembering yourself or setting yourself on fire in various ways. Yep, you definitely heard that right. Whether it's removing your arm on a spike trap to then throw your arm at something to trigger a mechanism, or it's setting yourself on fire to burn through an obstacle. Yeah, it's totally gruesome, but it's, in my opinion, just ridiculous enough that it's more fun and goofy than disturbing. The first few times, okay, this is what we're doing. This is a bit weird and creepy and gross. To give you an idea of how ridiculous and strange it is, there's one point in the game where you can use your severed head to knock over bowling pins in a bowling alley to solve a puzzle. It helps that the graphics are anime style is probably the best way to describe it, so it's not hyper realistic or anything by any means, which helps with the ridiculous nature of it all. So for a sharp transition from there, let's talk about how the story itself unfolds. Interestingly, there is very little spoken dialogue throughout the game, but like I said, that's probably for the best because the voice acting is pretty awful. But the majority of the dialogue occurs through text message exchange between JJ and her mom, FK, Emily, several of her other friends, her favorite college teacher. Yep, the stuffed animal FK is somehow able to text. Keep in mind, FK is not actually physically with you through most of the game, but he periodically texts you throughout the game. And this is where a majority of the story unfolds, is through these periodic text messages, and I do think they're very well written, so I highly recommend paying attention to them, and I also highly recommend, if you're to play this, to get as many of the 271 hidden donuts throughout the world. Yes, the hidden object in the game is donuts, for some reason. For every 10 or 20 or so, I don't know the exact number, or if it's kind of random, for every so many donuts you collect, you unlock additional text message exchanges that you would not normally get if you didn't collect the donuts, so it really helps flesh out the stories. Getting the donuts is obviously completely optional, but I really think you don't get the full experience without them. And I think that is the piece where you can quickly kind of pick up on oh, JJ is trans, or, if you don't know that plot twist ahead of time, you could be like, something's going on with JJ, and it kind of helps lay out the story in a more gradual process, because I feel like the reveal of JJ being trans, if you had no idea, would be very sudden if you did not have all that backstory ahead of time. So, the gameplay is fun, the writing is pretty good, the acting, not so much, thankfully minimal. Like I said, the graphics are also okay, typical anime style, indie game, not super high budget. I played it on the Switch, so the graphics are probably slightly better if you play it somewhere else. The game is really enjoyable at face value, but for me, I think it's the story that really makes it stand out. I would say, if we had to put it on a scale that's meaningless, I'd probably give the gameplay maybe a 7 out of 10, but the overall game I think gets easily bumped up to an 8 or 9 when you incorporate the story and everything comes together. And I will admit that I am likely very biased by the fact that I'm drawn to games that have trans characters. Heartfelt and trans representation in games, or really any media, is too rare. You know, the mechanic of repeatedly tearing yourself apart and putting yourself back together just to keep going toward the next obstacle. I mean, I feel like a lot of this feels like gender dysphoria to me. You know, specifically body dysphoria. You know, the pain of existing in a body that does not feel like home. And I think the dysphoria piece makes more sense as the story unfolds. You know, I revealed obviously that JJ's trans, but I don't really want to spoil any of like kind of the more specific details within the story. So it's heart-wrenching, it's very relatable, and there is some tragedy throughout the story. There are some really dark moments to be expected, but thankfully it does not end in tragedy. You know, that doesn't mean we can't go through an incredibly difficult transition journey and then eventually come to a happy ending on the other side. And that's what I really love about this game. It doesn't shy away from the ugliness of how society often treats trans people, you know, doing it in a very metaphorical fashion, and then the fears of coming out, but it's also uplifting in some ways as well. Although I told you that JJ is trans and that spoils a twist for you, I think it's good in a way that they don't immediately reveal that she's trans, because I think that opens up the game to far more people. Far more people will experience heartfelt trans representation, because they won't be dissuaded from playing the game at the forefront. And, you know, for people like me, knowing that she's trans is what convinced me to play. Other people will probably be drawn to the horror elements, which, admittedly, that's why I found out about it originally, was the horror elements, and then finding out that she was trans is what was like, okay, I will play this. But I think, you know, more and more people will play it, not knowing that ahead of time, and then going on this journey with JJ and then having this reveal, which in a way is kind of a trope, but it's not like a trope of like, oh my god, she's trans, gross. It's more like she's trans and all of this makes sense why she was going through such a tough time. Very, very different. It's more like coming out of the closet in a way than it is like a reveal. I needed to tell you all that JJ is trans for it to make sense why I'm talking about this game on my channel. But, you know, I've already seen so many reviews praising this game from many people that would not normally play a game like this or watch a movie or TV show centering around a trans character, which is another reason why I wanted to talk about it. You know, like I've said in the past, representation matters, especially positive representation. I mean, I think I said this at the beginning of the video, and it's still way too rare these days to see positive trans representation, especially in video games. You know, video games have played such a huge role in my life and my coming out journey, and it's just so wonderful to really have experienced this game. You know, I do again, though, warn any of you who have not played it, who are consider playing it, and I would guess that many of you probably haven't because it is somewhat of an obscure title. I would, you know, warn anyone who's considering playing it that the content, again, is not light. You know, some of the later text exchanges were a little difficult to read because they do hit close to home. You know, some of it is very relatable. Suicide is a subject in the game. I do find, you know, subjects around that to be distressing from my own struggles with suicidal ideation, which I think is unfortunately something that many of you can probably also relate to. You may not have ever attempted suicide, I have not, but struggling with suicidal thoughts, at the very least, is I think something that many of us can unfortunately relate to. You know, I really do appreciate like emotional stories and stories that are willing to dive into difficult topics, but I also feel that multiple trigger warnings are appropriate. I'm not one to throw trigger warnings on everything, but I do feel it is appropriate when the content can be especially distressing to, you know, people like myself, people like you, based on our identities. But I think I will stop there. I don't want to spoil too much more of this game in case any of you haven't played it and are interested in playing it, but I wanted to give you as complete of a picture as I could without making it too spoilery. Is that a word? Spoilery? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have any of you actually played it? And if you have, what do you think? Are you considering playing it now, or have you considered it at any point in the past? I think a really important question here is, are there other games with trans representation that you would recommend? Doesn't matter if it's like huge big budget game I doubt it would be. There was one that came out on Xbox very, very recently that I think was made by the same people that made Life is Strange. I can't remember the name, but I think a trans man was the main character. I really want to play that. But there are very few mainstream games with trans representation, so if you know any games whatsoever, please let all of us know. But anyways, as always, thank you so much for watching. Tipsy and I love you all and hope that you're staying as safe and healthy and happy as you can during these tough times that are still continuing. If you have not done so already, please be sure to give this a big thumbs up and hit that subscribe button and notification bell. I love you all, and bye for now.